Hello and welcome. My name is Toby C. Beans, and I'm a student of psychology at Southern New Hampshire University. Last week, in one of my classes, we discussed a research study done by the Pew Research Center about social media and the costs and benefits of using it. The study found that social media can often do one of two things. It can help build strong social supports and provide education and community to those in need, or it can make us incredibly aware of the wrongdoings of others, which could lead to stress, anxiety, and depression. As a psychology student and someone who likes to challenge the norm, I've decided I wanted to create a show that does both. I wanted to create a safe place where I could invite people to talk about the things they never talk about, to demonstrate that mental illness is everywhere and it needs to be addressed. People are suffering, but they don't have to be. Sometimes just talking about what happened is all you need to start your healing. We've decided to call the show Spilling the Beans, because we're spilling the beans on trauma, to end the stigma and promote healing. I intend to create another show where I go further into depth on these traumas and really break them down from a psychological standpoint and try to get a better understanding of what happened and how to cope. I'm calling that show Embracing Vulnerabilities. Before we get started, I'd like to give a bit of a disclaimer that we're talking about real-life people. In doing so, there are real-life consequences. For the safety of everyone involved, I'm going to be removing identifying information. That said, I know that the discussion of trauma can often trigger anger responses in people that might have been involved. If you are ever watching one of these videos and you believe yourself to be the topic of discussion, I urge you to remember that there are real-world consequences for revealing yourself. For your safety, please do not identify yourself. Here with me today as the very first person to spill the beans is myself, Toby C. Beans, who is here today to read you the police report from when they were strangled 4 years ago, this month. Toby wanted to come on the show today to finally discuss the truth about what happened and the effect it had, which is felt even to this day. Toby, how are you doing? I am well, thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. Now, it's my understanding that you tried to bring this to court once before, but it was dropped, correct? I'm quite certain that is correct. I'm autistic, and at the time, I struggled to understand a lot of things. Outside of the memories that are seared into my mind and these police reports, I don't have much of an idea of what happened with this case. Well, Toby, whenever you're ready, you can begin reading the report. I was dispatched to the address of a domestic. Caller advised dispatch that they were just strangled. Dispatch advised that the suspect had just left the area in a black pickup truck. I arrived on scene, and I was asked to come inside the residence by family members of the victim. When I entered the residence, I was told by the victim's family member that the victim needed to leave. At the time, the victim shouted from the basement that they were scared and requested that I speak with them downstairs. At this time, I did convince them to come outside, where I could safely talk to them in private. At this time, I spoke to them outside the residence, near or on the driveway. I asked them if they were okay, and they advised that their throat hurt from being strangled. They advised that the suspect put his hands on their neck and strangled them. They motioned to indicate strangulation and demonstrated that the suspect attempted to strangle them. I did not see any scratches, laceration, marks, or any injury to the area they were strangled. They advised that just before the 911 call, which was at approximately 12:08 hours, they were laying in their bed sleeping in the basement. They advised that the suspect came into the bedroom and told them to get out of bed. They explained that the suspect said to them that they needed to either do chores around the house or leave the house. At this time, they said that they told the suspect not to touch them, and after they said this, the suspect put his hands on the victim's neck and strangled until the victim had made a high-pitched yelp or scream. The victim advised that the suspect then left the bedroom. The victim advised that they were afraid due to domestic issues with the suspect in the past. Let's unpack this a bit. Set the scene. Where were you? I was at the home I was raised in. Mom and I had lived down the road in another house for a while. Though with the houses within walking distance, my mom and I were over at Grandma's frequently. My grandma did the same thing with her mom. We were a tight-knit group of women. My mom called us the 4 generations. When my mom had initially gotten cancer, I attempted suicide and put myself in a coma. When I woke up, I was different. I didn't feel like the same person who had gone into a coma. Turns out this is a known effect of comatose. I suspect it to be some sort of damage to the part of my brain associated with disassociation. I certainly struggled with dissociation after that. After hearing that my mom was going to die, grief hit me far too hard. As you and I both know from school, suicide attempts are actually commonly seen reactions to situations like these. Oh, of course. I even wrote a paper quite recently discussing the importance of health psychologists for this exact reason. Psychologists should have been involved and informed your family of the risks. Exactly. I had been in therapy and on medications for 13 years at that point, and I had woken up in a mental institution. You would think someone would have mentioned something about this being part of the grief process. I felt so isolated and alone, and I didn't understand that the reason was because my mom had begun treatment. When I woke up, I didn't really know who I even was. I was broken. I thought she didn't love me. Tell me more about your mother. You were talking about how it felt like she didn't love you. Were you in a position where you could even understand what was going on? No, not really. Comatose aside, she had shut me out. She told me about it in the middle of an argument, and made sure to specify that she had no intention of ever telling me or anyone else. I think she had a lot of internal problems with the diagnosis that she just really struggled to deal with, but for whatever reason, discussing mental health among my mom's biological family was very taboo, and a large part of the problem. In fact, it's what inspired this podcast, isn't it? It very much is. The suspect in our story was the original black sheep of the family. I heard he was emancipated at a young age due to his maladaptive behaviors. If he had gotten even the tiniest bit of the treatment I had received, maybe things would have been different for him. And you've mentioned that they had this knowledge when he was young, right? Yes, the DSM-3 would have been published around the time he was a child, and provided much of the foundation of our current diagnostic criteria, the DSM-5. Of course, we didn't have quite the understanding that we have today, but the DSM-3 would have provided him and the rest of his family with very vital explanations to his abnormal behaviors. Well, I've had my suspicions over the years, but I like to cite two very big problems as being responsible. The first is an article called "The Answer is 17 Years, What is the Question?" by Morris et al. From 2011, which discusses a 17-year lag between new research and the real-world applications. This is a flaw in the medical system, not our mental health patients. The second is that, even now, discussing mental health is considered taboo. You know how few conversations we got with our mom. Imagine how vulnerable he felt he was able to be in a world where he had less access to information. Now we're getting to the point of this podcast. Let's continue. What was the living situation? So fast forward a lot. I never got any help regarding my mother's illness, and honestly, someone probably should have checked in. I struggled to think. The only thing that played in my head for years were thoughts that I had to rush my life so my mom could experience as much of being my mom as she possibly could, because I knew that was her favorite thing. I didn't know how to do that, though. I wasn't honest with her about how I was trying to rush relationships to give her permission to die until she was diagnosed with stage 4. I told her my relationship was abusive, and I had only stayed in it because I thought it would give her permission to let go if she needed to go. She assured me she wasn't going anywhere anytime soon and asked me to come home, so I did. I had been maintaining dual residency between the apartment I was staying in and with my mom. I wasn't a dependent at the time because of the way that my disability was set up. However, I believed at the time that I was still under a conservatorship that my mom had told me I was under after an arrest I had when I was 15. And that belief is largely due to your autism, correct? Yes. It's something I think my mom had told me afterwards as a way of trying to control my behavior. She never corrected it, so I never had any reason to believe that it was a lie. You found out after she died, correct? Yeah, probably a year after, actually. That must have been incredibly difficult. So you were trying to move back in with your mom. What happened? The suspect, actually. The year prior at Thanksgiving and Christmas, he and his direct relative were talking about the value of the house being over $500,000. Whoa, that's an awful lot of money. Yeah, nobody believed them. It seemed like a silly conversation and just another one of those things that he just said and we don't pay attention to. That happened sometimes. So it was socially accepted to just ignore the things that he said. Sometimes other relatives would say he doesn't know what he's talking about. Interesting. He must have been pretty frustrated about that. I suppose he would have been, yeah. What next? His direct relative said some weird things about him selling her to his friends and such. Talked about how she modeled, asked me not to share that information with anyone, then went on to talk about how she thought everyone was a little bit gay sometimes. That seems a bit out of place. Do you think perhaps you misinterpreted this incident? Oh, I absolutely misinterpreted it. But I'm just recounting what was said. To this day, I'm not entirely sure why she said this to me. Perhaps it was a warning of what was to come. Oh, I never thought about it that way. Let's continue. What else was said? Well, they both told me that I needed to appreciate that year because it was going to be my last with both my mom and my grandma. That's pretty out of place, too. Do you think they might have known something? For a long time, I suspected that because the suspect was capable of attempting to take my life, maybe he could convince himself to try to take others as well. And now? I suspect it was just a realistic prediction based on the beginning of the COVID crisis. That's right. COVID was just starting back then, wasn't it? Let's get into the details of this. You said you were sleeping and he came in to ask you to do chores, and then you told him not to touch you. It seems like we're missing something here. I had returned to the house in February, shortly after the diagnosis. We were still working on things, but my needs weren't able to be met yet. We were still working on diagnostics, and I don't think she understood everything that was going on with me because she had so much going on herself. She wanted me home, though. That was always the theme. She wanted to be a mother. That was all she ever truly wanted. I was doing everything I could, but the suspect had basically decided to move into the house, and he had become aggressive, which prompted me to file a separate police report before this one. Oh, so this wasn't the first report you made? Or the last. Interestingly, aggression is another common symptom of grief. It's the anger stage. Do you think maybe he was afraid of these large familial losses? Oh, absolutely. And I had said some things to him that perhaps weren't the greatest. I accused him of being the reason that another family member had killed himself. Out of anger? Yes. I was struggling to communicate that while my mom and grandma were viewed as vulnerable to this virus, and ill enough to possibly pass that year, I was in the same exact boat. My therapists were telling me I needed to stand up for myself. I was finally getting better and standing my ground. I lived in that house for 15 years. It was built around the time I was born by my grandfather. I had just as much right to be there as him. And what happened? I was advised by police to find a safe place to stay and see if he leaves. And then what? He didn't. Let's continue with the reading. The victim advised that they had only been staying at the address for the last several days. They advised that they have a residence in another county. Victim did fill out a written statement. I did take photos of the area where the victim advised that they were strangled on their throat. The victim advised that they bruise weird, and marks or bruises will probably show up in several days. I was recently reading an article from the Texas District and County Attorneys Association from 2011, titled, "The Police Report Says He Choked Her. How Do I Prove It?" by Shelley Wilbanks, Assistant Criminal District Attorney in Wichita County. Let me read a quick summary for you and the viewers. The bruises were a little like constellations. If you connected them visually, you could almost see the shape of his hands. Her voice was hoarse, and her throat and body sore. She let the tears roll down her face, while she described to me how she bit, scratched, and kicked out her bedroom window as she fought back against him, eventually losing consciousness. Not surprisingly, her husband contested the PO, but the pictures we took of her injuries that day said it all. The judge granted the protective order, and I had a strong start on building the criminal case. Unfortunately, while these cases are frighteningly common, the evidence of strangulation I was able to collect for this particular case is rare. We all know that proving regular family violence assault cases is challenging enough because of the relationship between victim and offender, but proving domestic violence strangulation cases falls into an exceptionally difficult class. Police affidavits and reports often cite choking or describe strangulation as part of the assault, but rarely note any visible injuries or symptoms, leaving us to rely on either victim testimony or pictures of bruises from a non-strangulation injury to prove the case. Now that the legislature has elevated the assault of a family member by strangulation to a third-degree felony according to the level of severity, it deserves considering the high risk of death associated with strangulation. We as prosecutors should know how to look for and record evidence of such assaults for use in court. The new provision defines the offense as impeding the normal breathing or circulation of the blood of a person by applying pressure to the person's throat or neck or by blocking the person's nose or mouth. Note that though choking is generally used to describe strangulation cases, and indeed police reports and victims themselves might use that word, most of these assaults are more accurately defined as strangulation cases because while true choking happens when something becomes lodged in a person's throat, blocking the airflow, strangulation is clinically defined as the lack of oxygen characterized by closure of the blood vessels and/or air passages of the neck as a result of external pressure on the neck. So now that we have the new provision, how can we successfully prosecute these cases? So what you're saying is it's common to have no evidence in cases of strangulation? Exactly. They typically go off of other evidence. Continue reading. I did not observe injuries on the victim. When I first spoke with the victim, they advised that they had a scratchy throat and they were speaking in a soft voice. The more time I spent with the victim, I observed them speak in a normal voice to the point they were laughing on the phone when they called their friend to pick them up. I'd just like to make one very good point to you and the viewers here. Things can happen to your throat and you can still talk exactly the same. Sometimes having a sore, scratchy, hoarse throat from any activity that could inflame the nerves in your throat. Sometimes you could just ignore the pain, especially if you're somebody who is used to trauma. At this time, I have not been able to make contact with the suspect. I was advised that the suspect did have an appointment that he needed to attend during this time period. I will have an interview. I was told by family while on scene that the victim has mental health and suicidal tendencies. I did ask the victim if they were suicidal, and they advised that they are not suicidal, nor did they want to hurt themselves. I asked the victim if they would like to speak with a trained professional at a hospital for an evaluation, and they advised that they did not want to go. The victim advised that they do speak to a therapist regularly. The victim also advised that their family is saying that they are suicidal to discredit their statement. I did have Fire and Life EMS check them over due to alleged assault. They declined to be transported to a hospital. They did receive victim assistance information. The victim did get picked up by a friend to be taken back to another county. That friend was my childhood best friend's dad. He was probably genuinely the closest thing to a father that I was able to have as a child, and I will never be able to repay him for picking me up this day. He likely saved my life. To this day, I am undersupported and struggling to survive. Next is a portion of the report written by a different police officer, correct? Let's see if we can finish this. I was dispatched to a domestic assault between relatives that occurred at the above residence. Prior to law enforcement arrival, the suspect had left the scene. Deputy arrived on scene prior to my arrival and was speaking with the victim in the driveway. While the deputy was speaking with the victim, I did not observe any telltale signs of an assault, to include but not limited to red markings, scratch marks, bruisings, etc. I advised the deputy and the victim that I would be making contact with individuals within the residence. At this time, the victim stated they, the witnesses, are just going to lie to you anyways. While the deputy was speaking with the victim, I made contact with witnesses within the residence. I made contact with a relative who was directly related to the alleged suspect. I asked the relative what had happened. The relative stated that her relative, the victim's mother, is a hospice patient and is dying from cancer. The relative stated that she and the suspect have been helping the mother for some time now. The relative stated that the mother's daughter arrived at the house to help as well. The relative stated that the victim refuses to do anything and will not do basic housekeeping or anything else. The relative stated that the suspect told the victim to do some basic chores and the victim went crazy. The relative stated that she did not observe any assault, that the victim was verbally argumentative. The relative stated that the suspect did yell at the victim to help with work. The relative stated that the suspect had an already planned meeting with an attorney regarding the mother's estate at 1300 hours, so the suspect left the residence. What sorts of chores were they asking you to do that you could have had a reaction interpreted as crazy? First of all, I would like to remind everyone that I was asleep when approached. I slept really deep back then, and I was known for being difficult to wake up. He woke me up screaming that I needed to help take care of my mom. That's what they said you were there for, right? It is what they said, but I lived there. My mail still went there. My mom and I had spoken about how I didn't need to worry about this family member. She kept assuring me that I was just working myself up and he wasn't going to hurt me. She used to tell me stories of him smothering her. I wasn't sure how she drew that conclusion, but I trusted her. He did, in fact, hurt me. After screaming that I needed to help care for her, things like lifting her, which I could not physically do, nor could they. He began touching my feet, trying to get me moving. I told him verbatim, "Do not touch me," which was something my therapist had instructed me to do. I continued by telling him, "You aren't allowed to touch me." That's when he did it. I remember it. That's when he did it. I remember it as if it were happening right this very second. He approached me. My words seemed to have set him off, like I had offended him by telling him he couldn't do something. He stood over me. I tried to pretend I was big, but I was terrified. He grabbed my throat with both hands and pressed me into the bed, and he quietly said, "I can touch you whenever I damn well please, however I damn well please." I tensed my neck as much as I could and tried to scream. I had a medical band on at the time that I have the data to show where my oxygen had been cut off, and it can demonstrate that I was in a period of rest before my oxygen was cut off. I immediately called the police to report it and informed the suspect that I had called, and no one could leave. The suspect and his direct relative were attempting to convince me to leave. I told them that dispatch instructed that I stay where I was until the police arrived. So he knew when he left that you had called the police? Yes, I had called them before he had left. I then stood upstairs for a bit with his direct relative as I tried to explain to them that he had strangled me. They told me they had no idea why I would say such a thing. I was confused. This was not out of character for this particular person, who was known for his anger. The mother is a cancer patient in hospice care. She stated that the victim had arrived at the house a day or so prior and that they refused to help with anything to include basic chores. The mother stated that the suspect told the victim to help out with basic chores and that the victim began screaming at the suspect. The mother stated that the suspect did yell at the victim to stop acting this way. The mother stated that the victim has some mental issues and that she is leaving the estate in a manner so the victim is set for life due to the victim's issues. The mother again stated that there was no assault and did not know why the victim would say there was an assault. The mother stated that the suspect had a previously scheduled appointment with the attorneys referenced to her estate at 1300 hours. The mother stated that the suspect left the house after the victim's inappropriate behavior for the meeting. The victim was outside with the deputy when I exited the residence. The victim was speaking and did not sound raspy at the time. The victim requested the medical check them for a raspy voice. The victim stated that there were no other symptoms. While speaking with the deputy, the victim was on the phone with an unidentified person and was laughing and sounded normal at the time. Again, I just want to say, you can have an inflamed throat from something that causes inflammation in your throat. And you can continue to talk like you are enjoying your life. And somebody who experiences trauma does not need to remain sad or depressed or in that mindset. They are allowed to try to be happy. They are allowed to try to find joy in whatever they're doing. The suspect is the trustee of the estate, and I spoke with him, the close relative, and the mother. It was decided that the victim would be trespassed from the property. The suspect did fill out and sign the notice of trespass form. The deputy stated that he would trespass the victim. The victim requested that a deputy speak to them to reference questions they have regarding this incident, along with going back to the residence. The victim was ultimately trespassed from the residence. I made contact with the victim over the telephone. They were immediately confrontational on the phone. I asked what I could help with. They stated that they wanted to go back to the house. At this time, I advised them that their mother and the suspect had wished for the victim to be trespassed from the residence due to their behavior. They immediately began screaming at me that I had no right to trespass them. I advised that both their mother and the suspect wished for them to be trespassed, and a trespass order was signed the previous day. They continued to scream that they can go to the house if they want, because no one told them that they were trespassed yet. I told them several times that I am telling them right now that they are trespassed and cannot go to the residence, or they would be charged with trespassing. They continued to be upset, voicing their displeasure that the suspect had not been interviewed. I told them that I interviewed the suspect and that this report would be forwarded to the prosecutor's office for review. I advised the victim several more times not to go to the residence as they continued to voice their displeasure. I asked them if there was anything else I could help them with, and they stated no and apologized. I apologized because I knew at that moment I was likely to never see my mom alive again. I was heartbroken, devastated, but I knew that yelling at the deputy wasn't going to do anything for me. My mom was already gone. I wasn't even able to attend the funeral or memorial because they were held at the location I had been trespassed from. And the worst part is, for the past 4 years, I have battled with the thought that my mom never loved me. Those feelings I described earlier from my suicide attempt came rushing back. The suspect was harassing me, trying to get me to either return to the house, which would have resulted in my arrest, or trying to convince me to kill myself. I filed many more police reports, but nothing ever happened. Eventually, people started telling me to just give up and move on with my life, but I had nothing left and no one to turn to. Now I understand there's a recording you would like to play for us, a voicemail that he left for you. Now I want to specify that I am able to share this recording because it was freely given to me as a voice message and not recorded in secret. The suspect was aware that this message was recorded at the time of recording.
Hey, if you can't listen to what I have to say, then there isn't going to be anything else to say. Okay? You either call me back and talk to me, or there will be nothing between us. And I will take every dime of your mom's money, and I will make sure with a lawyer that I have to pay out of her account. You will win the trust thing, but by the time it's done, you won't have anything left. So either call me and talk to your mom, or nothing.
This recording was left on my phone after the strangulation, but before my mom passed. I was trespassed from the house already at this time. He had been harassing me for weeks, trying to tell me to kill myself. I had an officer speak to him to tell him that he was no longer allowed to contact me. It broke me to have my mom and my relatives trying to get me to come back to the house after trespassing me. In my heart, I knew she would have wanted me to be safe and not risk arrest. I knew she would want me to live. Whenever we would argue when I was younger, she would always get frustrated and throw her hands up and tell me, "I just want you to be happy." I lost all of my belongings, most of my clothes, and my things, my family, my home, my health. And the things that I was permitted to have that another relative had brought to me included my mother's picture books, with every picture of her removed. The only part of her I had left was her wanting me to be happy. So I made that all that was left of me. I'm glad I finally got to get this one out. I never got closure on my mom's death. I lost my family. I lost myself. I lost most of my belongings. I wasn't set for life. I had lost my life. This family member took everything from me, and I have to say that no matter how angry I was, I just wanted to see my family heal. Despite the pain and anguish, it inspired me to want to teach kindness and empathy in spite of people like him. He was my relative and I loved him. I always believed he deserved the same empathy I got, even with his poor choices. I had one last thing I wanted to read that inspired me. It's been a long time since I have talked about myself or my family. First, there's the grandfather, a wonderful, God-loving man who only wanted the best for his wife and children. He was always there for me when I was bad, and I was bad. He always had time to talk, play ball, and take me to different places like Indian guides, Cub Scouts, and baseball. He made sure that we had the things he did not. A man that never lied to me, strong, loving, and cared not just for family, but everyone he knew. The grandmother was a very strong woman, but very caring. She loved teaching, well, most of the time. She was always trying to make me a better person. She almost succeeded. I know she has influenced thousands of people. The mother, you could not find a better, more loving and caring person for anyone she ever met. I was a pain in her butt forever. I learned when I got old she loved me, and I loved her. Another relative, a man that reminds me of the grandfather. A man that loved his family. He loved to joke a lot. I wish I would have spent more time with him after the grandfather died. Maybe there was something I could have done to keep him with us. I have lots more of my family, but it's hard to talk or write about them. This was written by him, the suspect. I found it on Facebook. It was published some time ago to a public profile, sometime after the events of the report. It's an accurate depiction of the family, and like my grandma and my mom, I too am always trying to help others be better people, and I love and care for everyone I meet. And that really is the heart of this show. Learning how to love those that hurt us, moving past the pain and finding ourselves again. Telling those people that you see them, you see their pain, and while what they did wasn't okay, you don't want to hurt them further. You just want to see them be happy. Everything we have left of our mother, bettering the world.